One of the challenges right now is that so many people in the spiritual world have separated themselves from the political world. I'm not even talking about activism, but just simply curiosity and information.
Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection, how we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways, how our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics, how this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. All right, everybody, I would love to introduce you to Reverend David Wallace. He is recently retired as a dean and senior teacher for One Spirit Interfaith Seminary in New York City, my seminary, but still offers workshops for students and the general public through One Spirit and other retreat and spiritual organizations. He specializes in poetics, contemplative practice, and the wisdom texts of both the Eastern and Western traditions, and is now also teaching into the inquiries of how to navigate systemic collapse with both sanity and a sense of hope and community. Very interesting stuff. His recent seminars on the Tao Te Ching, the Gnostic Gospels of Thomas and Mary, the Cloud of Unknowing, and the Poetry of Rumi have drawn worldwide audiences as one of One Spirit's most popular teachers. I can tell you from experience that I love David's offerings, and they are really wonderful. So I'm not surprised that they are so popular. As an active, officiant, and spiritual director, he is supportive to people all over the world. He is a graduate of St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and has continued those studies as a lifelong student of the great books of philosophy and archetypal psychology. Prior to his work in interspiritual ministry and teaching, David has an extensive career in publishing and marketing, as well as award-winning work through the Soho galleries he created in New York City, The Enchanted Forest, and After the Rain. Known for his deep and passionate teaching style, he is currently working on a book and shares a home in the Berkshire Mountains with his partner, senior Kripalu teacher Jurian Hughes, and their beloved dog Smitty. I love that. What a cute name for a dog.
Well, we named him that because we were so smitten with him.
Oh, yeah, that's really sweet. Well, thank you so much for being here, David. I am so excited to have this conversation with you. I know that we could have so many conversations. So I'm excited to see where this takes us.
Well, hopefully we'll have many. There's so much to say, right? Particularly in this strange time.
Very strange time. Yeah. So let's get right into this strange time.
Sure.
So the reason that David is here is because he's an incredible spiritual teacher and very knowledgeable, but he also is politically knowledgeable as well, and curious about politics and culture and how culture, politics, and spirituality all come together. And so, David, let's get into chatting about how you see the intersection of politics and spirituality playing out in our current society.
Well, I think one of the challenges right now is that so many people in the spiritual world have separated themselves from the political world. I'm not even talking about activism, but just simply curiosity and information. There's a real movement in many of the communities that I teach in that somehow politics is beneath us if we're on a spiritual path, or that we need to take the 40,000 foot view always, which is to say, well, it's just a blip in the large consciousness of the, I mean, that's all true. That we just have a little tiny human experience on a long arc of the cosmos. But I worry that so many of my friends and colleagues refuse to enter into a political reality when, in fact, so much has gone haywire. Our friend Andrew Harvey would say, the world's on fire and everybody's just sitting on their mats. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. Why do we bother with a spiritual journey, right? I mean, a spiritual path. I mean, some of us are called into it, yes, and we don't have a choice. But what's the point, really? I used to say, we've got two directions, two choices. We can either escape the world or we can enter it. And that's an old spiritual battle. Shall we be transcendent, right? Or shall we be immanent? Shall we live in the planet as it is? And I think the invitation is to really create heaven on earth. Well, how do we do that, right?
Especially when it feels a little bit like hell sometimes right now.
Often, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, if there's a mistakenness in our quality of living, isn't it that we no longer see that we live in Eden, but are determined to devour it and make it look just like our inner life, so that the outer life is the same nightmare that so many experience inside, lonely, not connected, and to make your language real.
Yeah, and it's what you're saying, David, is so interesting to me. On the last episode, I spoke with a friend who ran for mayor here in Portland, Maine, and he said something that really took me aback, which was that apathy is the downfall of democracy. And I thought it was such a fascinating idea, and also really enlightened for me why I have been struggling so much. And he outlined some of the tactics that have been being used to create apathy, to create that sense of like, okay, whatever, I'm not going to get engaged in this because it's too much, it's overwhelming, it's too overstimulating. But I also think that your point specifically about people on a spiritual path and people who, are looking at politics or sort of the day-to-day happenings of the country and their community around them as not something that they need to be involved in. I know exactly what you're talking about, those people. And it's almost like political bypassing in some way. The term spiritual bypassing is something that's so often spoken about in spirituality. And it almost feels like there's a spiritual tendency from what you're saying to bypass politics. But that's not great because we are living in the world, as you said, and we are a part of this community. And what if the spiritual path and spiritual practice is to actually be here now and be a part of this, as opposed to disconnecting from it? Because there is a serious disconnect in considering yourself so connected that you don't need to be a part of what's happening around you, I guess.
We should say what spiritual bypassing is, because I think you're spot on about this. Spiritual bypassing says, well, because I'm spiritual, I don't have to deal with my crap. I don't have to do any hard work about, my family or this bad toxic relationship or my money, because I'm so enlightened now. And the problem with that, of course, is that if we don't attend to the life around us, then the life force has no hope. There is no way that we can save a planet if we are not willing to engage thoroughly with the inner work that needs to be done, but likewise to say that the political self is the primary vehicle for really changing the world. Now, that doesn't mean that politics is the only thing we need to do, But let's talk about politics just very quickly, okay? This politics word comes from a Greek word polis. In the early parts of Western civilization, the Greeks settled into little communities, little common life places of maybe 1,000 people, we think, probably, and what we in the textbook they call those city-states. But in Greek, those are called the polis, which also refers to a common life. Aristotle will teach us that by nature, human beings are political animals. By nature, human beings are political animals. And what he means by that, I think, is that our natural state is to be together. It's not to be apart from the tribe. It's not to just show up and throw rocks at anybody that shows up. It's not isolationism and building a bigger wall. It is understanding that we find our human happiness in community, in trade, in conversation, in dialogue, in helping, in commonality of breaking bread together.
Mm-hmm.
Well, back to this notion of polis, from which we get political, which is, it is our deepest nature to be with one another. And Aristotle says, of course, that's where we find happiness. Now, that's not what we now call joy. No, for Aristotle and for the Greeks, happiness was a sense of self, where we understand that working towards the good, and in this case, the common good, is where we find peace. And that when we break that nature, that natural place in ourselves, injustice occurs. And when injustice occurs, what happens? Anger, misery, blaming, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's fascinating what you're saying about the polis, and specifically this idea of happiness is really striking to me, because it does feel like what you're talking about is living in connection.
Beautiful.
And having connection be the point, and acting and living with values that we are all connected, and that there is contentment and happiness that comes from living connected and choosing connection and knowing that you are a part of something, because that sense that you are a part of something.
I'm thinking about Emerson here for as you're talking, you're just speaking right from Ralph Waldo's heart, which is, and then you wake up one day and you realize, oh my God, I am the forest. I am the chipmunk. I am the rock, and the rock is me. But at a certain point, if you can get rid of the blinders that keep you from connectedness, not only does that make sense, it's a deep invitation to how you're going to spend your few hours on this planet. And that also means to help the community decide how it wants to spend its resources and life, about whether to live in a compassionate world or a winner-takes-all world, to really understand what manifest destiny looks like, which is not about chopping down all the trees, but actually about bringing the great heart into possibility for all humans. To understand that wealth is not just money, but labor well offered in a holy sense.
Yeah, acting from a place of spiritual integrity is the way that I think about it. I think there's a sense of being in a place of integrity with where you're at that I think is essential in how you offer and use resources in the world.
Nice.
So speaking of this thing with polis, so you understanding that's where the idea of politics come from. In terms of democracy, so you're saying that like each of those polises would make the decisions about how the resources were spent or how things were governed, how things were managed. And so talk to me about democracy and elections and how that plays into us as spiritual beings and being connected. Because to me, spirituality is a tough one sometimes, David, as you know, because it can mean a lot of different things for people. I think that spirituality is experienced and not necessarily understood, but my feeling is that a lot of people who consider themselves spiritual or spiritual but not religious, in my mind, for me personally, part of what that means is that I believe that we are all interconnected, right? You're talking about Emerson, like these ideas that we are all connected and everything is connected. And the values that then leads to are values that take care of other people, resources, beings, the planet. So the idea that people who consider themselves spiritual, maybe some don't have that belief of interconnectedness, but it also feels in that sort of spiritual bypassing way, like, oh, we're all going to be taken care of. It's like, how much do we need to be part of the solution, and how much are we expecting spiritual source energy to solve the problems for us?
Yeah.
Like, what if we are the problem solvers that have been put here for this?
Yeah.
That was a lot of questions.
Yeah. Well, there's too much to say, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, a few things come to mind as you're speaking. Just to backtrack a little bit to where you started, we're all exhausted. This last decade has been just mind-boggling hard. I know other generations have had bad times and probably worse times than we have been through, but here we are now. And the problems, because we're connected, because knowledge bases are connected, because I can pick up my phone and tell you how much of the deficit was created under the Trump administration, which turns out to be about 20%. We know things that our little brains can't really hold on to, and even if they could, our hearts are breaking. Our hearts are exhausted. We've been pummeled by this fascination, particularly in this country, but worldwide, in seeing that corporate life must take precedence over individual life. And therefore, the accumulation of power and wealth has subsumed politics so that it always feels like David versus Goliath. Who wants to be David? Who has a slingshot? I mean, we all do. But in terms of where we are today and in this month of August, as we're looking forward to a very critical election ahead, as spiritual voyagers, by the way, we don't want to be voyeurs. We want to be voyagers.
It's so true. Important distinction.
So that's on the one hand, exhaustion. Another part of this conversation, I think, is that we are trained to be simplistic. We think that, well, if we just change presidents, everything will be fine. Or, well, we'll cut interest rates and everybody will be happy again. And let's face it, wealth inequality is a big chunk of this. And a Supreme Court that says corporations are humans, and corporations therefore have rights just like humans have rights. And as soon as you make that kind of story for the country, for citizens, then a political life is no longer about my little circle where I have agency, but it's about this big conundrum. Like, what's a corporation? How are you going to fight against a corporation? Corporation's not there.
Right.
You know, it's just, it's like it's another kind of mythology. You're going to take Google to court? Well, okay, good luck.
Right. And there's also this sense with wealth, I believe, as well, that one vote isn't actually one vote, right? Like there's this incredible imbalance in what a vote counts for. If someone has billions of dollars that they can sink into a candidate, that's a lot of votes, technically. Like not literally, that person is not voting a billion times, but they're doing a lot to push their own agenda. And so there is this sense of inequality amongst actual participation and input into a system that is supposed to be equal parts for everyone.
Gorgeous.
Which makes it quite easy to be apathetic again, right?
Right.
So it's part of the system that's really not working, obviously.
And therefore, what do we do if we are called spiritually to participate in community and in connectedness? I think that we have to remind each other that if there is anything like democracy, that voting matters. And that is to say, my voice, even though it's small and singular, matters. If Georgia if 12,000 people in Georgia were discouraged by otherness, we would have a different 4 years behind us. I mean, not just Georgia, but
100%.
You get my image.
I do. Yeah. It does feel compelling to compel people who consider themselves spiritual and maybe above or disenchanted with the idea of being engaged in politics, in that recognizing that it is a spiritual practice to cast a vote. And in fact, it can be a spiritual practice to advocate for something you care about, right? Like, sometimes there's these versions of what people consider spiritual practice. It's sitting for 20 minutes. It's chanting, or it's journaling, or it's whatever, blank, right? And you have to do it the same amount of time every day, or whatever that looks like. But what if spiritual practice is connecting, right? So it's connecting to the land, it's connecting to other people, it's being present in connection. And if that's the case, then taking care of our community is a spiritual practice, and it is a very worthy spiritual practice. So in terms of people engaging in politics, I guess as someone who is, well versed in a lot of spiritual traditions and in spirituality in general, why would you consider being engaged politically to be a spiritual path?
Well, let's not overdefine that. Let's say instead that part of being spiritually awake, which is a goal of the spiritual path, means an understanding that you live in a connected world, that you have agency, and that you have responsibility.
I'm curious too, as we're talking, there are definitely some spiritual beliefs that I think of as sort of more in like the new age, which I definitely dabble in for sure, that it is also interesting to look at from a political perspective. Things like everything happens for a reason. You're born when you're born because you're supposed to be here right now. Like this is your fate, right? And these different sort of like, you have a purpose in this life, or whatever it is, even reincarnation, right? Like for some reason you're here, you're a voting person in this country. And so there is some type of predestiny or fate. Then it was chosen that you were here as a voting person in this country, right? So there is a sense of, this is a part of your spiritual path that you happen to live here. There's an incredible privilege in being an American, and there's also a lot of challenges to being an American for many, many people, right? And so, but it is also where we are. It's where we live, and we are a part of this community that is a country, but it is a community. And it is complicated, especially because in many ways, the states are each their own countries, right? They all have their sort of own experience, their own culture, their own community. And so there is such different values. So it's just an interesting thing for people to be voting as a country with all these different beliefs and values. And yet at the same time, what if all of it just leads back to the fact that we are a connected society and we should be acting accordingly?
That's good. It's good. There's I can't come up with the title of the book right now, but I'm just onto a book about seeing this country in terms of 8 waves of immigration, and that the country is actually not 50 states, but 7 or 8 regions. English, Polish, German, Scottish, and so on. Hispanic, so that it's an invitation to really look at the cultural roots of the common story. I'll note you on that separately.
No, that's
because
really
it
interesting. Maybe
helps.
we'll find the name of the book and put it in the resources
I'll definitely,
so that people can find it.
do that. But the reason I'm pointing
Yeah.
it out here, Devin, is to make your point in a different way, which is, can there be a common story if there is a smorgasbord of stories? Yes, there's a common story, which is we bring with us the culture that we came from, the language that our grandmothers spoke, but we also bring with us this idea of possibility, of self-worth, of acceptance, and of helping one another, which
Unity.
is of unity. Thank you. Which is a very different model than we want to tell you what to do.
And we want to benefit from this place, looking at the United States, looking at the world as a resource, looking at people as a resource rather than a people, rather than a place, right? Like rather than something that has value, there's the hierarchical, this thing is here for me versus I am a part of this. And we are all a part of this, which is such a different value system for sure. Yeah.
If we can drop the I's and U's of our political understanding and see the us of it, the we of it, the unity of it, the connectedness of it, to make your point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, thank you for all of your insights. I do have another question, which I'm curious if you are willing to share, because it's not something that I have ever heard you speak to, because you're often teaching about specific topics. And so I am curious if you would be willing to and able to share what you do believe in terms of your spiritual understanding, your spiritual path, your spiritual beliefs. Because I think it helps the listeners to understand what people believe spiritually and how that affects their values, and then accordingly how they're voting, obviously, and how they see things politically. So it's a big question, if you're willing.
I remember when I was about 10, I was in a Methodist church. My parents were Methodist. My grandfather was a Methodist minister. A couple of my uncles, too. And I was sitting in the front rows of church while the pastor was trying to raise money for missionaries to go to India to save those poor heathens. And I can remember at that age just realizing how ridiculous that was. That even though I didn't know anything about the history and culture of India, that civilization had lasted a lot longer than ours. And for us to put our imprint on it was silly, was ridiculous. This is hard to say in just a few minutes, but I'll try since you asked.
I know.
One of the problems with monotheism is that it says that there is one primary energy and all the others have to be avoided. You shall have no other gods before me. And there are times when I understand that the God is actually love. I'm happy to fall back onto the love as the way. That makes a lot of sense to me. And it's true for me. You know, when I fall out of love, when I don't find the God, the eros in my life, I know that there's a problem. I need to wake up the eros God in myself. With flowers, with hummingbirds, with a book, with a poem, with a good piece of music. For me, the invitation is to see all the gods at work, all of the desires and longings and possibilities. I grew up around farms and ranches. I grew up in corporations. I've worked in corporations. I've had a small business. I've been on the streets. With 38 cents in my pocket. I've hitchhiked across the country and feared for my life. I've been in strange countries where I wasn't sure where I was going to sleep. If we don't bring all of that into the conversation, all of our griefs, we lose so much in our life. The Spanish have that lovely word duende, which is it's trying to capture what we in English say a bittersweetness, that there is both a sorrow and a joy, and if both of those can be, you see, it's not just the joy, but it's also being
both
open.
and.
Yeah, it's both and. What does that mean for me as a spiritual? I mean, practically, I'm a meditator. I pray. I'm a centering prayer person. I've been a Tonglen. I met Pema Chodron when I was 40, and she crumbled my ego. You know, I've had a lot of good juju in my life. I do all that stuff as best I can. But
you've also experienced a lot from what I know, and you were a chaplain during 9/11 in New York, which was very impactful in your life and your spiritual practice and path.
Yeah.
And have experienced an immense amount of grief. And so I know that it's both your experience and what you've learned from other teachers that has informed where you are now, which I really appreciate.
I need to say one more thing.
Yeah, of course.
Our friend Andrew Harvey has, he's kind of the current father of something called spiritual activism, which is, it's a movement that goes back as long as there have been human beings. And particularly in the Christian traditions coming out of Rome and the horrors of Rome, people escaping into a meditative life, but also seeing that as a kind of activism, that to keep soul alive. The Irish monks hiding on Erin during the Dark Ages, just copying Aristotle and the Gospels over and over and over again, without which we would have half of the classics would not have survived the great book burning from the fear that was engendered in Europe in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages. And Andrew would say to us in this moment, and I guess I'm saying that to you and me and everyone who might be joining us, what's breaking your heart right now? Everything's so big, so complicated. It's too much. You're just a little David. There's so many Goliaths, but what's breaking your heart right now? And take that place and see if you can be, in Tonglen, we say, if we're breathing in and breathing out, we're taking in that dark place and imagining the light place flowing out. We're taking in the pain, we're flowing out a little blessing. And that great reciprocity of energy that actually seems to have effect. In my life, it's had deep effect. And so in Andrew's language, to see what's breaking our heart and then use that as a place of activism. Doesn't have to be such a loaded word. Nobody's asking you to go on the street and confront cops. Activism is something like, I just donated some dog food to the local shelter because they're strapped for dog food.
And so you're saying paying attention to what's breaking your heart, and then how can you contribute in some capacity, somehow, to that place. And I think that's great, because I do think that, again, this may be a tactic that helps us to remain apathetic, but I do think that there are so many things going on right now. There are so many things that are breaking people's hearts, and it can also be really overwhelming for people to be like, where do I get involved? How do I be of service in some capacity? Or like, if I start, I'm going to have to do it full time. There's this overwhelming sense. And in addition to that, I think that part of what keeps us separated in many ways and disconnected from the political world is that it is hard. And yes, it's a privilege to be able to say this, but it is hard to look at the reality of things. We don't want our hearts to be broken even more, right? Yeah. And I get that. And we are also a responsible people that need to be a part of creating change, or it won't happen, right? Yeah. So, yeah. And what if it is a spiritual act? What if it is a part of our path to be a part of this change, that this is the path forward, right? So, yeah.
I don't have the Niebuhr quote at my lips because I'm going senile slowly, but Niebuhr has that great phrase it's in a book called The Irony of American History, which I'm trying to reread now. And he says, anything that's good or worthwhile in this life won't be accomplished in this life.
Ooh.
And therefore,
that's a good one.
I'll send you the quote. You can put it in the resources.
Mm.
In other words, we're saved by faith. Well, that's not faith. That's not faith that a Messiah will come down and only I can save us. And that's a different kind. That's like, okay, I'm going to throw my little pebble into the pond and there will be a little ripple. Diane Burke often uses that image when she teaches. This beautiful sense that this little stone, so small, puts out a little bit of energy that spreads out over the pond, and it has some effect, and you will never know what the end product is. But to live as
right, so it's trusting your impact will be made eventually, even if you don't get to see it. And we're such a society that's very reward oriented. Right. Like, I want to see it now. I want to see it, right? But I do think, and this came up a lot actually in the DNC, and there's one speaker who I can't remember who it was, who specifically said that we're doing this for future generations. And I think that that's so important. Where, it's for our children and our children's children. I don't have children. And there are a lot of people, there's a lot of cat ladies and dog ladies, people who don't have children. But it's, what is the legacy that we are leaving here? And what if that is what matters, right?
Yes. Beautiful.
And choosing love, if that's the legacy that we can leave, then that's the legacy I want to leave for sure.
Just one more little bit here. In a time of so many guns and so much anger, Matt Fox said one time, justice means sustainability. And is it sustainable to live in a country that is angry and full of explosion? And I say that it's not. And therefore, we must seek justice. This is the old cry of the Old Testament of Isaiah and Jeremiah and everybody else, And therefore, we have to attend to the common story, to the rooted story, to our actual histories, to the way we are with one another. And what we teach in our spiritual centers, because these are not ideas. Ethics is not an idea. It's an invitation to live your life differently or more awake, more effectively, and with a true consciousness that we affect one another, even if we never know how.
Right. It's so true. So true. Thank you so much, David, for joining us.
God bless, Devin. Thank you for this time together. It's lovely to talk to you. Lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, it's lovely to talk to you too. Yeah. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me for this episode. It means so much that you're taking time to join me in this journey of living the connected way. You can find all the resources I referenced in the show notes and on the podcast page at theconnectedway.com. A note about sponsorship. This podcast is currently sponsored by me, Rev Dev, and you, the listeners. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and me doing the work of The Connected Way, you can donate on the podcast webpage or find easy links to donate in my bio on Instagram at RevDev_The Connected Way. There is never any pressure, but any support helps me to continue doing this work. Also, I'd love to hear your biggest takeaways from the show today. What inspired you? Surprised you? Made you think? Anything? Let me know by posting a comment or DMing me on Instagram, or you can always send me a message on the website. Thanks again for being here, friends. May this podcast bring more connection to you and to the collective. And so it is. See you next time.